Everyone loves a good gambit. They may not always be the most sound openings, but they're definitely a good way to spice up your repertoire every now and then. So in today's video, I thought it would be a cool idea to go through every single popular chess gambit and put it all into a tier list. Before we do start today's tier list, I should mention that I am by no means an expert in any of these openings. But based on games I've played, studied, and my analysis of these openings, I'm able to come up with a relatively decent tier list. If you disagree with any of them, let me know in the comments below, but for now, let's get into the video. The King's Gambit. Although it's not played at the Grandmaster level now, the King's Gambit used to be a top choice in the 19th century for players like Paul Morphy and Adolf Anderson, and occurs after e4, e5, and f4, gambiting a kingside pawn. The King's Gambit doesn't look too bad on an engine evaluation, but we still need to look deeper into its lines to figure out if it's good or bad. It's also important to note that in some of these gambits, the opponent does not necessarily need to accept the gambit, which in some cases can be good, and some cases can be bad for us. But in the case of the King's Gambit, I feel the entire opening doesn't really count unless they accept it. After knight c3, the first trap is set if black plays knight f6. White will play e5, taking full control over the center, going on to win 64% of games on Lichess with a plus 0.5 evaluation. However, in games over 1800 on Lichess, knight c6 is only played 10% of the time, so I feel it's a bit amateurish to say this proves the King's Gambit is a good opening. However, in games over 1800 on Lichess, the correct move of queen h4 check is only played in 22% of games, with 17% of players playing g5, which immediately hands white an advantage after h4. I won't go through all of the theoretical lines in this video, but after h4 is played, white typically wins in 64% of games on Lichess after g5 is played. But the real question is, are any of these advantages worth what happens in 22% of games where black plays queen h4? Well, as surprising as it might sound, considering the white king ends up on e2, blocking in its own bishop, black is often rather forgiving in these kind of positions. Even if black knows good theory to the King's Gambit, they always end up in positions that have no single way to capitalize on. So even though white is down roughly 0.7 on evaluation, the familiarity of such chaos honestly favors the white side, considering in almost every game they play as white, they play the King's Gambit positions, whilst black would only face it in 2.64% of their games, making the positions much more unfamiliar. So even though they know good theory, white still has great chances. Due to the organized chaos of the King's Gambit, although it's not really a Grandmaster opening, I feel it's still a very decent choice and belongs in the B tier. If you see any gambits you think you might like to try in this video, you might also be interested in the sponsor of today's video, ChessMind.ai. Most courses obsess over memorizing hundreds of opening lines, but ChessMind is built around something different, understanding positions and not just remembering moves. The goal isn't to know more theory, it's to know what to do when theory runs out. That's why the courses on ChessMind only take around an hour to complete, because the priority isn't on memorization, it's positional understanding. For just $7 per month, you can unlock over 50 courses on ChessMind, plus access to their AI coach, personalized puzzles, and training videos hosted by Chilean Grandmaster Mauricio Flores. And with my link in the description, you guys can get 20% off your purchase too. But now, let's look at the Vienna Gambit. The Vienna Gambit feels like a bit of a cheap opening to me because the idea behind the gambit is just so simple. After e4, e5, knight c3, and knight c6, you play f4. If black takes, it's immediately +1 as you play e5, kicking the knight back to its home square, proceeding to take in the center. After knight f3, d6, d4, d takes e4, and queen e2. You just get a really solid position if they take, and you don't really have any fun positions. It's kind of just all principally better, and there's not too much creativity involved. If they do accept the Vienna Gambit, white wins in 57% of games above 1800 on Lichess. But in the same sentence, no one ever takes the Vienna Gambit, and in 65% of games, you get d5. After f takes e5, knight takes e5, and queen f3, black can play f5, which is a pretty horrible move to try and play against. Remember, in this line, they didn't accept our gambit, so we're not down a pawn, but after d3, knight takes c3, b takes c3, and d4, you need to gambit the pawn by playing queen g3. After d takes c3, you play bishop e2, threatening bishop h5 check, with sacrificing ideas, but bishop e6 stops all of this with development for black. I'll actually be the first to say I don't mind this kind of position for white, and I would certainly rather play with the white side than the black side. But in games over 1800 on Lichess, black wins 53% of the time, so the data does not back me up. So paired with the fact that almost no one ever accepts the Vienna Gambit, and the d5 refutation is quite uncomfortable, the Vienna Gambit goes into the C tier. I just think this d5 refutation actually leads to quite an interesting middle game for white, so I feel like it doesn't belong any lower than the C tier, and it feels like a good ranking. The Queen's Gambit. I kind of considered not not putting the Queen's Gambit in this video at all because it's such a well-known and solid opening. I mean, they named a TV show after it, so that's gotta be bonus points as well. If you started playing chess yesterday, the Queen's Gambit occurs after d4, d5, and c4. Black accepting this pawn allows white a few options, and I think the fact that white has numerous good options after the pawn being accepted only alludes to the fact that this gambit is good. If your gambit literally gives you multiple good variations, it's probably a good gambit. The caveat is none of these lines are crushing. The Queen's Gambit accepted is even played at the Grandmaster level, so it's definitely not somehow losing just because they accept. But white gets good attacking and dynamic positions if black chooses to accept the free pawn, which white should win back relatively easily. Black can decline the pawn in many ways, one of which is by playing the Tarish defense, which is quite drawish at the top level of chess, but is still extremely playable at just an advanced or amateur level. There's simply no real downside of playing this opening at all. Maybe it's not as exciting as some of the other gambits in this list, but I still feel that it comfortably belongs in the S tier. It's such a flexible yet solid opening choice. The Budapest Gambit. The Budapest Gambit is maybe one of the worst gambits in this whole list. It occurs after d5, knight f6, c4, and e5, gambiting the e-pawn. The idea is after d takes e5, black has knight g5 counterattacking the pawn. If knight f3, black can swarm the loose pawn and win it back with knight c6. Whilst in a lot of games, white will play bishop f4 and hopelessly try and hold on to the pawn, white can just play knight c3 and play with a positional edge. For example, after knight c3, knight g takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, e3, d6, and f4 is an extremely strong setup for white. It's weird though because for a setup so obviously advantageous, barely anyone ever plays it, even at the higher levels on Lichess. However, even players who don't find this crushing line often stumble their way into wins, as after the knights are traded, black wins in just 40% of games above 1800 ELO on Lichess. Even in alternate lines like 5 bishop f4, black only wins in 40% of games, so essentially in every line where black plays 4 knight c6, white is favorable. However, if black plays for bishop c5, threatening checkmate on f2, forcing e3 first, the odds change a little bit. After knight c6, now the win rate is balanced between both sides. But still, after a3, a5, and knight c3, we're still in this position where if black trades off the center, white will come with f4 and be in a crushing position. I just don't really see a good reason to play the Budapest Gambit at all. Unless white is incredibly stupid, black won't even really get interesting positions and will just be worse. The positions are very direct and there's not much chaos to them, which makes it very easy to study from the white side. For all of these reasons, the Budapest Gambit will be the lowest in this tier list so far, going into the D tier. The Scotch Gambit. The Scotch Gambit was a worthy inclusion of this video and was actually the first opening I ever learnt with 1e4. It occurs after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, e takes d4, and bishop c4. At the lower levels, bishop c5, c3, and d takes c3 is a common mistake from black, allowing the brilliant bishop takes f7 check, because after king takes f7, white wins back the piece with queen d5 check. But at any advanced level, this mistake will not occur. In bishop c5 lines, where c3 is played, but black does not accept the free pawn, they score relatively well, winning just as many games as they lose. The same can be said about knight f6 or bishop b5 check. Black scores pretty well in these openings, as although white's idea was creative, it doesn't create much chaos and is quite easy to study from the black side. There's not really much else to say about the Scotch Gambit. It's solid, it gets some interesting positions, but considering how much success black has in these kind of positions, I don't see any way that we can put it above the B tier. The Danish Gambit. The Danish Gambit is a super interesting opening and is kind of a derivative of the center game. It occurs after e4, e5, d4, e takes d4, and c3. What's interesting about the Danish Gambit is there doesn't seem to be any kind of line where black gets off easy. Attempted refutations avoiding d takes c3 might give black a slight edge on evaluation, but practically speaking, the positions are great for white and the Lichess win rate backs this up. Of course though, the Danish Gambit we're all familiar with comes after d takes c3, which in games over 1800 on Lichess, white has a fantastic success rate with. The engine gives this position a pretty balanced evaluation if you take on c3 with the knight, but a lot of players will choose to gambit a second pawn with bishop c4, allowing c takes b2 and bishop takes b2, affording black a negative 0.5 advantage. But for an opening that gambits two separate pawns, I just don't really like the positions you get from it. If your attack fails at any point, you essentially lose the game by force due to being down on material. In a lot of cases in the Danish, the only real way to get some big attack is by making a dubious, punishable move. I can definitely appreciate the chaos from an opening like the Danish Gambit. No two positions are ever the same, and it would be very difficult to study from the black side. The Lichess win rate for players over 1800 on Lichess prove that this is a very playable opening, but just because of the fact that it gives up two separate pawns out of the opening, so if you make one mistake, the game is almost over, I have to put it into the B tier as well. The Smith-Morra Gambit. Now we can move on to the Smith-Morra Gambit, which is one of the gambit lines in the Sicilian defense after e4, c4, c5, and d4. Black is essentially forced to play e takes d4 here, allowing white to play c3, which is similar to the Scotch and Danish Gambit. A big problem for this Smith-Morra Gambit is that you kind of have to be okay with playing the Albin Sicilian if your opponent doesn't want to accept your gambit, as knight f6 and e5 will transpose. However, the Albin is a good opening, so this isn't going to take any points away from the Smith-Morra. After d takes c3, unlike the Danish, you always recapture with the knight on c3. It must be said, you need to be pretty booked up if you want to play the Smith-Morra, as it's a gambit with organized chaos, and you absolutely need to know the unintuitive punishments to common mistakes from black. If you've watched a single Mark Esserman video, you'll know how dangerous this opening can be, and I've played against witty alien Smith-Morra enough times to know this gambit is the real deal. On Lichess, players above 1800 score well with the Smith-Morra as white, and I honestly can't see a single downside to this opening whatsoever. A good way to describe it is by comparing it to the Queen's Gambit. In the Queen's Gambit, you get solid positions, but you also win your pawn back very quickly. In the Smith-Morra, you get amazing attacking positions, but you might have to wait a while to win your pawn back. I guess you could argue Sicilian players are more prepared for something like the Smith-Morra Gambit, but even so, it's very difficult to study as there are so many lines, and especially in online chess, this opening is such a great weapon. Call me crazy, but I genuinely think the Smith-Morra belongs in the S tier with the Queen's Gambit, both boasting their own unique qualities. The Englund Gambit. We'll keep it very short with the Englund Gambit as it's just not a very good opening. It occurs after d4 and e5, immediately giving up a central pawn. After d takes c5, knight c6, and knight f3, the Solar and Hartlab-Schalik sidelines of f6 and d6 aren't difficult to play against at all. They essentially just hand you the 4 pawns advantage, and as long as you sensibly trade down material, you'll end up in a winning endgame as white. If queen e7, which is the main line, after bishop g5, queen b4 check, knight c3, queen takes b2, bishop d2, bishop b4, rook b1, and queen a3, white just has knight d5, bishop takes d2 check, queen takes d2, queen takes a2, rook d1, and king d8. Now it's black who's up a pawn, but white almost has a +3 advantage, and as long as they've briefly studied the middle game, they should dominate. White wins in 67% of games here, over 1800 ELO on Lichess. Of course, there are slight deviations, like knight b4 instead of bishop b4 on move 6, but they're just as easy to punish. The Englund Gambit doesn't really create much chaos, and there are only 2 real variations which are quite easy to study. While they may work at the lower levels, the consequence of white knowing theory is just too much for this to be a good gambit. This is maybe the worst gambit in the entire video, so it comfortably belongs into the D tier. The Alien Gambit. You know, when I started writing the script for this video, I actually was going to be very harsh on the Alien Gambit because I've studied the theory to it, and once you know the theory to it, it's quite easy to play against. But then I looked at the Lichess win rate, and oh my god, how bad can black be? What's even crazier is that this is in games over 1800 ELO on Lichess, so it literally doesn't matter what ELO you are, people that play the Alien Gambit will get good results regardless. It obviously occurs in the Caro-Kann after e4, c6, d4, d5, knight c3, d takes e4, knight takes e4, knight f6, knight g5, h6, and knight takes f7, sacrificing the knight. Of course, this is gambiting a piece, not a pawn, but come on, how could I not include this in the video? The king has to take to avoid being fought, and after white plays knight f3, somehow 13% of players above 1800 ELO blunder bishop g4, and knight e5 check, just blundering a full piece back to white. Only 11% of players find the correct line of c5, which is still very playable from white, although black wins in 51% of games to white's 45% if they know the theory. However, only 11% of players on Lichess know the theory apparently, so black ends up losing a trillion different ways by players who think they're too good at chess to learn the theory to a very elaborate and well thought out sacrificial opening. The opening is chaotic and it's extremely fun to play with, and because Witty Alien is such a good friend of mine, don't spam the brilliant emotes in the comments because this is going into the S tier. We follow up the Alien Gambit with possibly one of the most boring gambits in all of chess, the Benko Gambit. It occurs after d4, knight f6, c4, c5, d4, b5, c takes b5, a6, and b takes a6. Although there are slight deviations, we'll follow the main line for the purposes of this video, with bishop takes a6, knight c6, d6, e4, bishop takes f1, king takes f1, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, g3, castles, and king g2. This might seem like a long line, but there's basically no deviations in the theory, so although it's a long line, it's the only long line, so it's not as complicated as it sounds. The theory essentially ends here for black. They'll try to use their strong fianchetto bishop to snipe the diagonal, often targeting the rook on a1. But in these kind of positions, black only wins 45% of the time, with white winning 47% of the time. And that number is only so low for white because a lot of them don't know the theoretical solve to the Benko. If after knight bd7 you play a4, queen b6, and rook a3, black's winning odds drop even lower. Because we've lifted our rook away from the dark square diagonal, we can now aim to play queen c2, b3, and bishop b2 to trade off the bishops. Once the dust settles, white has a passed pawn, and more often than not, it's utilized very well. I just don't really see the appeal of ever playing the Benko. You'll get good results against people that don't know the theory, but it's not overly fun, it's not overly effective, and there are just better options like just playing the Benoni. The Benko isn't as bad as the Englund Gambit, but I can't see it going any higher than the C tier. The Latvian Gambit. The Latvian Gambit is a pretty dynamic one that follows the moves e4, e5, knight f3, and the immediate f5. One of the reasons it's so dynamic is because it gambits two different pawns. But is it actually good? Well, firstly, if e takes f5, black wins in 51% of games above 1800 elo on Lichess, so clearly it's not a solved gambit. It's also very clear people do not study the Latvian Gambit as the white side, because after just a few moves of theory like e4, knight d4, knight f6, d3, and c5, literally 88% of players as white throw away the entire theoretical advantage by playing knight b3 instead of knight b5. Black wins more often than white in these positions, so even though technically speaking white should be better in practice, it's not the case. Even in games where white does find knight b5 though, black still wins more than white. Even if white plays all of the best moves, the advantage is still unclear too, as it's difficult to hold on to their extra pawn. So if e takes f5 usually works out fine for black, what about the theoretically superior knight takes e5? Well, now queen f6 is the main idea for black. If d4 defending the knight, d6 will be played. Somehow, knight f3 is played in 19% of games here. I'm not really sure how, because it plunders a pawn with no compensation, but knight c4 should be played instead, and usually is. However, this allows f takes e4 for black, regaining their pawn. After knight c3 and queen g6, essentially every player is out of theory as white, and again, black wins more often than white. It must be said though, if you do know theory as white, it's pretty positionally hopeless for black. Because of the nature of this line returning the pawn back to black, white catches up on development and has a pretty dominant position. This opening feels just about as good as the Danish Gambit to me. I know it does sacrifice a lot of evaluation, but it's pretty chaotic and I feel like there's plenty of opportunities to come back in the game. So into the B tier it goes. The Elephant Gambit. We now look at another alien-approved gambit with the Elephant Gambit, which occurs after e4, e5, knight f3, and d5. Similarly to the Latvian Gambit, this one gambits two pawns. Let's first look at e takes d5. After e4, 50% of players above 1800 on Lichess throw the advantage away. The other half maintain it with queen e2. After knight f6, d3, queen takes d5, and knight c3, black wins a staggering 56% of the time, which is just incredible as white is just playing all the natural looking moves. After bishop b4, only 4% of white players play the correct knight d2, clearly showing they don't study the Elephant Gambit. So we know this variation is very good for black. What about knight takes e5? Well then, bishop d6 hits the knight with tempo, forcing d4 and d takes e4 in response. In this setup, white's advantage is very narrow even though they've played all the best moves. It's only plus 0.6. With that, only 25% of players find the correct bishop c4, and even when they do find it, 56% of players on Lichess above 1800 elo win as black after bishop takes e5, failing to find the crucial queen h5 to avoid the queen trade. In the more popular variation of knight c4 instead of bishop c4, the win rates balance out between black and white, but that's just because the evaluation is dead drawn. I never really knew much about the Elephant Gambit before making this video, but it just seems incredibly effective. And paired with that, most black players don't know the theory to it at all. So with all that being said, I feel like it genuinely belongs into the A tier. It doesn't forfeit a huge evaluation deficit, it's not studied very often by the black side, and it gets really dynamic positions. What's not to love? The Blackmar-Diemer Gambit. Blackmar-Diemer Gambit is an option to spice up any d4, d5 game. It comes just on the second move where white will strike with e4, gambiting said pawn. After knight c3, black should follow with knight f6, transposing also into the Hubsch Gambit. After the continuation of f3 in this position, white wins in over 52% of games on Lichess in games over 1800 elo. However, the evaluation favors black by 0.6. After e takes f3 and knight takes f3, black has a few options, but it's very clear black typically doesn't know the theory to the gambit, opting for the best move just 8% of the time. In 39% of games, they give up their entire advantage with bishop g4, where white wins 54% of the time, and in 28% of games where they correctly play the U defense with e6, white wins a staggering 62% of the time. It must be said the ideas in the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit are quite easy for white. You essentially just want to opposite side castle and go for a big attack on black. So whilst you don't get incredibly complex positions, you do get very good attacking positions at the cost of your pawn. It's simple, it's effective, and to me, they seem like relatively good positions to an otherwise boring d4, d5 game. For me, this gambit comfortably belongs into the B tier. Now the Albin Countergambit. You've definitely seen the Albin Countergambit because of its flashy under promotion lines, but does it actually work? It occurs in Queen's Gambit positions after d4, d5, and c4, where black will counter White's Gambit with e5. If c takes d5, black will just play queen takes d5, knight f3, knight c6, knight c3, bishop b4, bishop d2, and bishop takes c3, escaping any pressure and has comfortably equalized. However, what if White accepts the gambit with d takes e5? Now, black plays d4, invading White's space and holding onto their pawn. However, it must be said White wins 50% of games from this position, whilst black only wins 45%. Only 8% of players over 1800 ELO fall for the trap and play e3, where black has a 58% win rate. However, after knight f3 and knight c6, the problem is all of the defending moves for White are just the natural looking ones. Even if White goes ahead and plays incorrect theory, the natural looking moves still get good positions regardless of what the evaluation is. The Albin Countergambit might be a very useful opening at the lower levels, but it's not really a serious gambit. It might be harsh, but I just don't see it being on par with the Benko Gambit in the C tier, so I think it belongs in the D tier. With all that being said, that's our tier list completed for today's video. If you want to see a part 2 of this video where I rank more gambits or maybe even openings, let me know in the comments below. I read essentially all of my comments, so if you guys leave one, there's a high likelihood it'll be in the next video. Also, let me know in the comments which gambit you guys play and which ones you think I overrated the most. But apart from that, thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.